Ladies and gentlemen, in the world of classical preparation and memorized lines, one event shattered the mold. 2024, the Freestyle Chess GOAT Challenge. No engines, no theory, just pure, unfiltered brilliance. On one side, the titan of modern chess, Magnus Carlsen, calm, ruthless, unshakable. On the other, a rising storm from India, Gukesh D, young, fearless, ready to rewrite history. When instincts take over and the clock ticks down, only one can stand tall. This wasn't just a game, it was a statement, a battle, a legacy in motion. Gukesh versus Carlsen. Freestyle, raw, legendary. Quote ChatGPT 2025, April 14th, whatever. So that now that you know what the video is going to be about, let us see the game that shook the world or something, whatever it said. So we have Gukesh as white, and we have Carlsen as black. And as I elaborately and beautifully explained in my intro, uh, Magnus Carlsen is one of the best players, obviously, and Gukesh, who is not the world champion, but is now the world champion, and wasn't that worse a few months before near the candidates. Wait, yeah, he was champion in 2024. 2025 candidates are going to happen. So, we have this, and Gukesh won the game, which is really surprising because it's a surprising encounter of world number one and world champion. So, without further ado, let's jump into this game. Also, notice how Gukesh is about 100 points low rated. I'm pretty sure this took classical ratings into account, but they didn't change the classical rating. I think they had some sort of weird system, but I don't dive into that stuff. So let's begin. So, in freestyle chess, or also more popularly known as Chess 960, the board is set up randomly. And if you just want to skip this whole entire part, because why not? You can. But how it works is that you can castle regularly, like normal. Um, I think it's to their regular squares. But there are a few rules. The bishops obviously have to be on opposite colors. I'm pretty sure two rooks can't be on the same side of the king. And I think that's it. So the usual strategy in freestyle chess is to open your queen and bishop because they're the most active pieces and you want to get them out. So either starting with c4, which is a bit riskier because you expose your king, or f4 would be great. Starting normally, like moves with g3, won't do you any good because that's just not how it works. And by the way, both setups are the same for both sides, so there's no unfairness. And we have a rare position where both the rooks are on this side, so here flank attacks will also be powerful. So a move like f4 is great. A move like e4 would also be decent opening this, but unlike f4, the bishop is less active with e4 because it only controls a few squares um, compared to f4. And like I said earlier, f4 is closer to the flanks. That's why I like to play moves that are in 960 closer to the square where your rooks are. If your rooks were toward the center and your bishop, like if this was switched, then e4 would probably be better. But in this case, f4 is closer. So we play f4, c6. Gukesh decides he's going to go for a more solid but more aggressive approach on Magnus's pawn. g3, just to secure the pawn. There's no apparent purpose. I would have, of course, just played like knight e3 because also like knight d3, like freestyle chess, it's not much different except the fact that your pieces are differently spaced. You always want to develop your pieces in chess, so there's no reason to go beyond that. Yeah, and I wanted to mention here that there's also f3. They're moves like this that develop both the queen and the bishop, but they're risky. So there are a few moves you can choose from usually. We have g3 instead of knight to d3, which I don't think is great, but it, uh, you know. And also, this opens up this diagonal, which if there's no bishop on, which can get quickly to c3, can sometimes be a problem. So if Gukesh immediately wants to target it, as he did in the game, he can force Magnus to play a move like knight to f3 in this case. Or if it was not that simple, let's say the knight wasn't here and something else was here, and maybe there's just a rook on c1 or something. Not a rook on c1. Yeah, I guess it would have to be a rook. A rook on c1. Then you would have to play e3, and after bishop to d5, you would have to play bishop to f3 and block. But also, in more high level terms, this wouldn't be great for you because as you can see, the color complex here, it is mostly designed towards dark squares. And now your dark squared bishop is kind of neglected from life because um, all the pawns are mainly on dark squares. You usually, in an optimal situation, want a 4-4, but a 4-5 or a 5-4. I mean, I don't know what I'm saying, a 5-3 or a 3-5. And what I mean by this is the amount of pawns on light squares and dark squares, you can take them in either order, is great. But in this case, we have, I'll do different colors. We have 6-2, which is not a great combo, especially when the bishop can't fianchetto on this square. If it could fianchetto, it would be fine, but not optimal. But it can't even do anything, so this is just horrible. And that's why Gukesh just wanted to test Magnus. And obviously, if Gukesh ever wants to, he can play bishop to d5 and ruin his structure if the light squares start getting occupied, which Gukesh is starting to do. It's still 5-3, so it's technically fine. We have bishop to d6, so Gukesh is going of a strategy to trade off his dark squared bishops and likely create a dark squared complex. Though it is interesting that most of his pawns are on light squares compared to dark squares. Also, as I mentioned earlier, you would want to play, well, not just pawn moves, but moves that could trade off closer to the flank. Closer to where your rooks are, because like this move is pretty nice, and that's why he also played f6 earlier, because now we don't care about the structural integrity that much because he gets huge compensation on this rook. And moves like this are sometimes hard to get out of because unlike regular chess, your pieces get kind of cramped trying to defend. If you play a move like a3, there is really not much escape before black doubles and rolls down the a file. So pressure is more needed in freestyle chess. It's more important, and especially if you're going to exploit the defense of your opponent. So that's kind of the reason you can't take. We have c3, so Magnus is like, sure, you want to play, I'll go bishop to b3. Copying isn't such a bad strat in freestyle chess. I mean, unless you lose pieces, it's not that bad because your opponent obviously decided to play a move for a reason, and if it doesn't harm any of your structure, it's actually pretty fine. So we have takes. And the reason you're like, okay, why do I have to take? Maybe I'll play like knight to d6, or maybe I'll play b6, who knows? like Magnus G6, I mean. But the reason you have to take is because the problem now is that um, Magnus attacks your pawn, and after you play G6 or something, you have basically committed to doing all of this stuff. 6 to 2, as I mentioned earlier, is a bad combination. And if Magnus immediately locks you out with d4, it's not that bad because you have e4 and potential d5 ideas. Though you have to deal with bishop d5, you'd have to think about that. Maybe you'd play the rather calmer knight to e3. But my point is that you might lose the opportunity to exchange. So it's kind of a now or never situation. And you would need to do it now because you can't do it later. Bishop takes g1 and knight to d6. I mean, typical moves. Developing the knight to the center. Now d3 or some sort of like knight to b4 maybe later. Maybe to play copy and then play knight to b4 or something like that. But he decides to go to e3 and is like, Gukesh, put your knight out here, but it's not that good. It can go to g4 where it gets hit by h4. By the way, the coordinates are kind of weird, so I might mess up the coordinates. This is a4 and this is, yeah. So knight to b5, which is hit with a4, and your knight is just going a lot of places and not exactly doing anything. The problem with this is that Magnus now kind of hinders the idea of c3, which was to do this and this, and his queen is now blocked. So he kind of hindered the idea, but he's also in exchange hindering the mobility of Gukesh's knight. We have b5, and now also he ruins the structural kind of integrity of his king. He's moving, like in normal chess, you don't want to move the pawns in front of your king that much. And Gukesh is like, I can follow the same um, things, rules, I don't know, policies, investments, I don't know what you call it. But I think they're called principles. Yeah, principles. That you want to obviously attack if your opponent's king is weak and you don't want to move the pawns in front of your king. So Gukesh is like, okay, my bishop b6 didn't work earlier, so I'm just gonna straight up launch a lot of pawns at you. And you'd be like, okay, but Gukesh, he also has his king here. So doesn't that mean if he opens up his king, he'll be unsafe? That is true. But if you look at the position, like this one, Gukesh's pieces are much more active and suited for attack rather than Magnus's pieces that are not that active and still currently developing. So Gukesh has the authority to attack, and because he has good development, well, Magnus exactly doesn't. We have e4, and Magnus is also adhering to one of the principles, which is that if your opponent attacks you on the flank, you should open up the center. Because typically, in a close center position, White's Magnus's pieces will have much harder time developing, and therefore might even not get to his king that fast. So when you open up the position, your pieces have more space to move around and can quickly come over in need of danger. We have fe4 to e4, and Magnus is like, look at my beautiful center and look at your attack. And now that you look at it, Magnus's position doesn't look half as bad because Gukesh might have something on the king side, queen side over here, but it doesn't look half as bad because Magnus's pieces are also pretty active now that break would happen. We have queen b6, knight 1 d2. And you might be like, oh no, he hung a rook. Well, he didn't because you can't see, obviously. So, um, he develops his knight. It's not like it's a super complicated idea move thing. You can play like bishop to e2. It doesn't really matter. Well, don't let queens. Well, I would be a bit scared letting queen to f2 happen. So maybe this is just better because if queen to f2, you might be like, oh no, he's getting my position. Well, actually, if you noticed, if you have a king I can't draw arrows. Okay, if you had a king I, then you would notice that actually everything is protected. The pawn, the rook, and any of the other squares that black would maybe like to infiltrate are protected by the pieces, except here where you further get chased out. And if you want to repeat, that is Magnus's choice. I don't know if you wanted to repeat. It's default repetition, yeah, etc., etc. So we have could be 6-2, which is normal, and we have g5, and this is where the goofy stuff starts. So Magnus is like launching pawns at the king side. No, not Magnus, Gukesh. Um, there's no apparent reason. He's just launching pawns. Uh, the first reason is that there's no apparent thing where you can't take, but the further response would be to target this pawn and try to. Actually, this is what happened, and try to take down this pawn. But it's actually pretty interesting because Magnus can always defend this pawn with h4, and it won't be that easy. So I'm assuming that maybe it would be used to create an IQP, isolated queen pawn, or what we call when this pawn has no friends like you, and it is simply lonely, also like you, and it has no future, also like you. So, um, it has no friends, so, and this is a doubled pawn structure where there are two pawns and it has too many friends. Um, but obviously, a lot of friends might be good in some cases. But this pawn is really here to back his friend up, so he is completely safe. So I'm guessing it's just to isolate the pawn and to target it, as long as this pawn just as an appetizer on the side, which can be targeted actually by some kingside moves. So I'm to stop yapping, and then rook to e1. So Magnus is defending, and he's being like, okay, Gukesh, let's see what you got. My pawn is not going to fall that easily, and you'll have to work for it. Gukesh is like, does it look like I care? And he plays bishop to f7. Bishop to f7, like I mentioned earlier, it's just a simple developing move. There's many people think that grandmaster moves are really complex, but not all of them are complex, and they actually really adhere to some of the natural rules in this um, kind of format, which is kind of interesting to see. So bishop to f7, developing the piece, and Gukesh is like, okay, Magnus, let's see what's gonna happen to your pawn after I pin it to your queen. Are you gonna defend it more, or are you gonna sacrifice it, like I did to my pawn? And he's like, okay, does it look like a carrot? If you play here, then sure, I'll sacrifice the pawn, but look what happened to your structure. And okay, I just wanted my queen, but and it's not like I immediately give the pawn away because you can't capture here, and it'll take a long time for you to actually win back this pawn, which assuming would be in the end game. And Magnus is like, okay, I'm up a pawn and you have bad structure. My structure isn't that bad because I have h4, and this pawn is pretty well protected, so I don't have to worry about it that much. Gukesh is like, do you really think I will play bishop to g6? And he's like, no, actually. He castles. And Magnus is like, no, actually. And then he castles, yeah. So we have this castle This is kind of suspicious why he didn't castle here. I don't know how it is to castle in this. Okay, yeah. Because I would think that, okay, it's Magnus's pieces are all naturally pointing. That's what I like to think about when I am castling. They're just, you can naturally feel that they're pointing towards the king side. I mean, I don't know, it's really confusing. Queen side, king side, I don't know. King side, I think it is. Rather than pointing naturally towards the queen side where many of the pieces aren't. You can just feel it. So that's why I would, and your pawn that you desperately made like this is especially on on that side. So you probably don't want to castle that way because you can't win the pawn back that easily. So castles. So I don't prefer this move, as I said, and Magnus doesn't really care about castling because he is the GOAT and this is the challenger. We have queen to c2, and Magnus is like, okay, I don't see your attack. I don't know what you're doing, so I'm just gonna castle this way. And if you're gonna attack me, I don't care. So a5, and Gukesh is like, okay, let's see. Your bishop is almost trapped, and my attack is back. So good for you. And that was the purpose of Gukesh's move, short castles. I think it is. Yeah, short castles. And it's kind of surprising how the distance is like so large, yet it's short castles, but okay. We have queen c2 and a5, and Gukesh is like, "Where's what do you mean? What happened to my attack?" And Magnus is like, "Okay, well, if you're gonna continue with your attack, which isn't supposed to work, then I am going to attack you." And we see that this knight, which has been developed like on move 4, is starting to be useless because it has no squares, which Magnus smartly played e3 to do that. And it has no friends, no squares, and it has to go backwards. Or first this, and then backwards. So what happened in the sequence of moves, Gukesh is like, if I move blind knight, then you get to move your knight, and I don't like that. And Magnus, and then Gukesh plays bishop to g6, and Magnus decides, okay, well, you do what you do, and I will win that pawn happily. And I just dropped my mouse. Yeah. Just 1 second. Okay, I'm back, chat. So I'm back. So queen to b3, and he wins the pawn, and Gukesh is like, I'm down 2 pawns. My position kind of sucks because I'm gonna lose another pawn actually if I play bishop to f7. So I have to pin myself, which is usually a horrible idea. But when you're down 2 pawns, it's kind of a different mindset. Like, it doesn't really matter. I mean, it really matters about the next pawn because if you're down 2 pawns and you're not what rating you are because you're probably 100, then it is fine to lose every pawn because you'll still win. But when grandmasters play, activity is prime rather than material, and activity is pretty good. I'd say decent. Magnus still has the upper hand, I would say, but his king, which he didn't castle, and he said he was better, is kind of suffering, which is surprising. But yet he is fine. Knight to d4, and Magnus is like, okay, what happened to your queen? I'm just going to block it, and I am further going to advance into your territory and destroy your king's position. Knight to c5 takes and uses yet another pawn, but in exchange for an exchange. Yes, in exchange for an exchange, which Gukesh declines. So this series of moves may be confusing, but what happened was that basically there's no way to prevent this. So It's like, I think I would take the exchange because if he took the exchange, Magnus's activity, as I mentioned earlier, is still pretty good. I mean, look at this. These rooks are not coordinated, even if you play rook to f8. My pieces are still pretty good because I don't know. Wait, one sec. Yeah, because wait, something is happening to my computer. She's really sad. Is there no? Whatever. So yeah, like I said before, my position is pretty good. Is pretty good because yeah, it's just great. If you play here, I have here, and I am just simply annoying you. My position plus my over over doing pawns is destroying your position. And even if you're like, okay, I just move my rook, then I have this. And I'm coming down these two files. And you can't do anything about it. So we had knight takes b2, and Gukesh is like, no sir, I am going to take the pawn. Even though he's down, let's see, two here. And then even though he's down two pawns, his activity is still soaring, and king's safety for Magnus is going straight down. So rook to c8, and e6, Zwischenzug, bishop to h5, and Magnus's king is coming out of its hiding spot. And Gukesh is essentially trying to exploit this, so it's actually just a challenge of who can exploit what first. Rook to g7, targeting the pawn, but as I discussed earlier, h4 simply defends the pawn, and I don't know why I didn't play it. Actually, I do know why I didn't play it because the knight was hanging and I can't see. So instead, he plays this move, and after takes, he can defend his knight. And Magnus is like, okay, well, now the tables have turned, and I'm kind of losing, so I'll just lose the pawns and try to stay safe. Rook to d8, rook to d7, and it seems as though Magnus has developed something, but Gukesh's bishop is light squared, and Magnus's anchor of the position, may I say, the only thing keeping him alive is the pawn, which is also on a light square, which is really bad news for Magnus because there are tactics like this where if you just play a random move, you actually can win a pawn just like that. In this ending, Magnus is definitely losing. So we have rook here, rook to e5, because if you take now, I take your life. I take your life. May I move this piece? Yeah. So we have rook to g6, and now there is absolutely no way that Magnus can defend the pawn. Only he can do it tactically, because if you capture with either piece, there is knight to f6 with discovery. We have king to g7, therefore, escaping this discovery and now officially threatening the pawn, which cannot be defended, so he loses yet another pawn, and now completely losing Magnus plays on because he thinks Gukesh is garbage, but Gukesh isn't garbage, and he wins the game. There's nothing much instructive in the rest of this game, so I'm just going to skim through it. So Magnus wins a pawn, but it's kind of over because compared to a regular pawn, this pawn is probably worth two pawns. He might be like, you're out of your mind, but I'm not. Because this is considered an outside passed pawn. See, the outside passed pawn is much more, well, you might know the passed pawn, but the outside passed pawn is even better. Because unlike the passed pawn, the outside passed pawn is actually away from the action and over near the corner. And what's even better is that you can just put a rook behind this guy and just push. There's literally nothing else you need to do. And you can just make a queen and win the game. But compared to another pass pawn, you do have two sides to defend with, but you also have two sides to deal with. So rather than defending both sides of the pawn, you would probably rather just defend one. And I made a sword. That's cool. My sword. And so therefore, you should have an outside pass pawn. But Gukesh is like, does it look like I care? Well, he has to pass pawn. So Magnus is like, does it look like I care? Gukesh says you should. And after a few moves, Magnus is like, okay, I won your biggest asset. But Gukesh is like, and it's really instructive to me how even in an endgame with equal amount of pieces, somebody could actually lose this game. And it looks like it's completely equal. But there are obviously tactics underlying the position, and Gukesh is cornering Magnus's king yet again. We have rook to a3. Magnus is like, you're not doing anything to me, so I'm just gonna chill over here in the corner. Gukesh is like, I am about to destroy your position, so you shouldn't chill. And Magnus is like, oh, let me just push my pawn. Gukesh is like, nope, no pawn for you. And after a few moves, Gukesh loses another pawn. But that's to distract Magnus's horses. And after a few moves, Magnus eventually falls to the wrath of Gukesh. And that is the legendary tale of Gukesh versus Magnus. Hope you are having a great day. Like and subscribe. Do whatever you want to do. Check out my other videos. And see y'all later.